Holtzclaw lecture series. My name is Dan Fuller. I teach English at Hines Community College, Utica, and I'm also a co-director for the NEH grant, William H. Holtzclaw and Black Man's Burden. Before I formally introduce our speaker for tonight, I wanted to acknowledge the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which awarded the humanities team at Hines a grant to study Holtzclaw. The grant has three primary outcomes. One is the establishment of a new humanities course, which will be taught in the fall. The second is the publication of a critical annotated edition of Black Man's Burden. And the third is a summer institute for high school and community college instructors to be held in the summer of 2017. With the support of the Mississippi Humanities Council and the Margaret Walker Center here in Jackson State, we're able to extend that work with this series of public talks. If you haven't already signed up, we have a sign-up sheet out there for our newsletter. We'd be happy to keep you updated with other events. I'd like to thank just a few people for helping make tonight's event possible. Our grant co-director is Jean Green, Director of Library Services and Utica Archivist, Dr. Bobby Cooper, the Humanities Chair and Director of the world-renowned Jubilee Singers. Other Humanities Grant team members include Sharon Melton, History Instructor, Randy Minton, Art Instructor, April Trimble, English Instructor, and Ivy Arrow, Speech Instructor. I'd also like to thank Dr. Robbie Luckett and his entire staff here at the Margaret Walker Center. Thank you for hosting us today. And thanks also to Dr. Rico Chapman in the History Department for his help coordinating all of this, and to Dr. Stuart Rockoff at the Mississippi Humanities Council for your work. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. William Andrews comes to us from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he is the E. Maynard Adams Professor of English. Bill is published widely in the field of African American literature. His books include To Tell a Free Story, A History of African American Autobiography up to 1865, and The Literary Career of Charles W. Chestnut. He has also co-edited major anthologies in the field: the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, the Oxford Companion to African American Literature, and the Literature of the American South, the Norton Anthology. Since 1988, Bill has been the series editor of the Wisconsin Series and Autobiography, which publishes original autobiographical writing, as well as historical and critical investigations into life writing. He is also the series editor for a digital humanities project, the North American Slave Narratives, Beginnings to 1920, which is a complete digitized archive of autobiographies and biographies of slaves and ex-slaves. So we are certainly in good hands tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Andrews.
Thank you. That's a very nice introduction, and I appreciate very much being here. Good evening. And it is a good evening for me, and I hope it'll be a good evening for you. I'm really honored to be here, to have been invited to speak on this occasion. This is an opportunity to remember and appreciate and ponder the life and legacy of a great man in Mississippi history. Yet I suspect his name is hardly known outside this county, perhaps outside this state. Your efforts should help to remedy this gap in public memory. So congratulations to Dan Fuller and to all of his colleagues on the grant team and who are executing this grant so well. I hope that I can play a constructive part in what I consider to be a really interesting and important undertaking. My topic tonight, as you can see, is William Holtzclaw, the man, the mission, and the mask. The man had a mission, that's pretty obvious. He was obliged to wear a mask in order to achieve that mission, and I want to talk about all three of these aspects, although I will spend the least amount of time tonight talking about William Holtzclaw's biography. What I'm more interested in is his autobiography, The Black Man's Burden, which was published in New York City in 1915. It's not very well known. I read it 35 years ago. I suspect it's still not very well known. Not well known in literary circles, not well known, I suspect, in many other ways. But I believe The Black Man's Burden is a lasting testimony to African American leadership in the Black Belt of the American South at a time when white supremacy was at its most virulent and African American prospects seemed the bleakest since the abolition of slavery 60 years before Holtzclaw published his autobiography. So this is the title page of the autobiography. And as you'll see, there's an introduction by none other than Booker T. Washington himself, who wrote, quote, "Mr. Holtzclaw has written this story not merely of the life of an individual or of a school, but at the same time a very important chapter in the history of Negro education." In this statement, Washington noted two of the three aspects of William H. Holtzclaw that I want to explore tonight: the life of an individual, that is the man, and the life of a school, the mission to which the man dedicated his life. Holtzclaw's chapter in the history of Negro education follows Washington's own autobiography, Up from Slavery, which came out 14 years before The Black Man's Burden. Holtzclaw was highly influenced by Washington and his autobiography. The Black Man's Burden came out in the same year that Booker T. Washington died. I think it's pretty clear from reading The Black Man's Burden that Holtzclaw wanted to do some of the same things through that book that Up from Slavery did for Washington. Up from Slavery gave Booker T. Washington another strong claim on a national, not just regional visibility, while serving as an advertisement for the school, which The Black Man's Burden is also an advertisement for Utica Institute. And Up from Slavery, like Holtzclaw's autobiography, also represents the educational philosophy that both men believed in very strongly, that Holtzclaw actually imbibed by going to Tuskegee and then bringing the mission to this part of Mississippi. Obviously, Holtzclaw could have picked no one more famous than Booker T. Washington to provide an introduction to The Black Man's Burden. It must have been gratifying when the great Tuskegeean identified Holtzclaw as a classic poor boy who made good. Washington emphasized that Holtzclaw was a product of Tuskegee, which he was. Quote, "I do not know of a single graduate of Tuskegee who has more completely carried out in his life the spirit which the school has sought to instill in its students. Nor do I know one who is doing a more useful or more successful work for his race, for the community in which he lives," unquote. That's Washington in the introduction to The Black Man's Burden. That's high praise and just the sort of endorsement that an up-and-coming young man in Holtzclaw's position would want from a figure of such eminence as the sage of Tuskegee. Washington's introduction reveals little of William Holtzclaw, the man, the individual. Washington contends accurately that The Black Man's Burden is mainly the story of a school, unquote. And the same observation could be made about Up from Slavery. That autobiography is arguably mainly the story of a school, too. And in this regard, we can say that the authors of both Up from Slavery and The Black Man's Burden were committed to identifying themselves as founders of institutions. Now compare this to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, which was published in 1845. That text is very much the story of an individual, a rebel slave who fights against institutions. Obviously, he fights against the institution of slavery. He's also very critical of other institutions, such as the Christian church in the United States, because the white church provided institutional support for slavery. The pre-Civil War slave narrative is primarily concerned with individuals who undertake a quest for personal power, free from institutional control. But after slavery was abolished and Reconstruction was brought to an end in 1877, African American autobiography became increasingly dominated by men who identified themselves not as individual African Americans fighting against oppressive institutions, but as builders of institutions designed to uplift African American moral character and socioeconomic prospects. The two dominant forms of African American autobiography between emancipation in 1865 and the Great Depression of the 1930s are the life stories of educators and ministers. Those are the dominant forms of autobiography produced by Black Americans during this span, 1865 to the Depression. During this 65-year period, a number of clergymen, in many cases bishops in the AME or AME Zion denominations, published autobiographies and focused on how these men were converted to a Christian mission and thereby learned to adapt their individual ambitions to the needs of the churches they were trying to found and the denominations they were trying to extend the influence of, particularly in the South. Now, they also emphasized, these men between 1865 and 1930 in their autobiographies, that as individuals, their lives have little significance, which is an oddly unegoistic claim for an autobiographer. After all, autobiography is by nature an egoistic act. The typical autobiographer, I don't care what color he may be or she may be, says in so many words, my life is so important, everybody needs to know about it. For African American autobiographers, however, after emancipation and up into the Depression, it has usually been strategic and politic to represent themselves as self-sacrificing rather than self-seeking individuals. White supremacy distrusted any African American individual who seemed too ambitious, too self-assertive, or too bigoted. To invoke an old Southern term my mother was fond of applying to me when I was a teenager. This was especially true a century ago. Not about my mother, but about the way that white supremacy regarded any African American who had the temerity to write an autobiography that really was an advertisement for himself. Thus, African American autobiographers like Washington and Holtzclaw tend to portray the fulfillment of an individual life occurring when, as Washington put it in Up From Slavery, one learns to lose himself in a great cause. It's not about finding yourself, it's about losing yourself. What kind of an autobiography is that? Well, it helps to explain why Up From Slavery or The Black Man's Burden are more stories of a school than they are of an individual. It's the way that in both texts that it gets to be hard to tell the difference. When did this autobiography become the story of Utica instead of the story of you, Mr. Holtzclaw? Well, that's the way Washington did it too, and look how successful it was. The most widely read African American autobiography for close to 100 years. For Washington, the great cause was the founding of an institution, the Tuskegee Normal School for Colored Teachers, which was Tuskegee Institute's original name. So Up From Slavery set a mold, set a pattern for what I call institutional autobiographies, a particular type of African American autobiography that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Up From Slavery and The Black Man's Burden are notable examples of institutional autobiographies by educators Washington in 1901, Holtzclaw in 1915, William J. Edwards, author of 25 Years in the Black Belt, 1918, Robert Russell Moulton, of course, Washington's successor at Tuskegee, Finding a Way Out, his autobiography, in 1921, Rosa J. Young, Light in the Dark Belt, 1929. These black educators came of age during a time when African Americans had to focus their energies on establishing and building institutions that would sustain the race against the onslaught of systemic, cradle-to-grave segregation and white supremacy that pervaded the South by the turn of the 20th century. So Up From Slavery became a blueprint, a sort of how-to manual for men like Holtzclaw who wanted to build institutions like Tuskegee. But Up From Slavery also became the model for autobiographies that institution builders like William H. Holtzclaw wrote when they decided that they, like Washington, could use autobiography to advance their missions as institution builders. Washington understood identifying himself with a mission rather than emphasizing his story as a man would be a very strategic way of advocating what no black man in the South, and certainly no black man in the Deep South at that time, could advocate openly, which was black power. Yet every school like Tuskegee, founded in the South in the early 20th century or late 19th century, was an instrument of black power. James K. Vardaman knew that. Unabashed racist and bigot, who was one of Mississippi's U.S. senators when The Black Man's Burden was published, Vardaman understood the threat that schools like Tuskegee and Utica represented to white supremacy. As Holtzclaw noted in his autobiography, Vardaman, as governor, abolished the only state-funded normal school, that is a teacher training school, for African Americans in the entire state of Mississippi. The Black Man's Burden records Holtzclaw's conversations with a number of white men in the Mississippi Delta who, Holtzclaw wrote, quote, seemed to be afraid of the results of Negro education, unquote. One Delta planter promised to send his bright Negroes from his plantation for Holtzclaw to educate, but then only on one condition. When they're educated, I want you to keep them or send them somewhere else. I can't use them here in the Delta. What I want here, the planter told Holtzclaw, is Negroes who can make cotton. They don't need education to help them make cotton. I can't use educated Negroes on my place. Holtzclaw's career as an educator was devoted to empowering black people, particularly those like himself who had been born in the most disadvantageous circumstances in the Black Belt of the Deep South. But like his mentor and hero, Booker Washington, Holtzclaw was careful not to articulate the power ramifications of his school's educational program. Similarly, like Washington, Holtzclaw gave his readers only partial access to his innermost self. Today, readers want full access to the innermost self when they read an autobiography. You know, don't hold anything back. Tell all. By contrast, the autobiographies of institution builders like Washington and Holtzclaw rarely allow us into the inner sanctum of the author's motivations, desires, needs, and goals. They'll tell you what they want you to know and no more. As black men in a white supremacist South, Holtzclaw and Washington knew they could not gain and wield power for themselves or their institutions unless they kept much of their personal thoughts and feelings to themselves. In this sense, these autobiographers wrote behind a mask. The Black Man's Burden is designed to make it very difficult to distinguish the private man from the public mission and the public mask that Holtzclaw constructed to protect his privacy while advancing his mission. There's a lot William Holtzclaw wants to tell us in his 232-page autobiography, but about 2/3 of it is really the biography of Utica Institute. Only the first third of the book is focused on Holtzclaw's life and development as an individual. This is not a criticism of the black man's burden. I'm not suggesting that the first third of the book is personal and there's something wrong with the latter 2/3. The latter 2/3 is a history of a school that grows from its founding with one teacher and 20 pupils in an abandoned shack to, a decade later, a school with 33 faculty, 560 students, 1,600 acres of property, and a $40,000 annual budget. That's what he did in 10 years. Holtzclaw's biography of Utica, which occupies the last 2/3 of the black man's burden, certainly offers a perspective on its founder's views and values, but tonight I want to show how and why Holtzclaw masked himself in his autobiography. What he wants us to know is his mission and how he accomplished that mission. We may ask questions about what's behind the story he is telling us, but let's first begin with the basic historical facts about Holtzclaw. He was born in a log cabin of a sharecropping family near Roanoke, Alabama, sometime in the mid-1870s. He never knew when he was born. A regular field hand by the age of 9, he was determined to improve his education and prospects in life, very much supported by his parents, who were both illiterate and former slaves. Beginning in 1890, he went to Tuskegee, going to the night school and working all day on the farm. He worked his way through to graduation in 1898, learning the printer's trade in the Tuskegee shop. One reason why it took him 8 years to graduate is because he supported a brother and a sister who both went to Tuskegee while he was there. Turning down an offer to teach at Tuskegee, Holtzclaw taught for 4 years at Snow Hill Industrial Institute in Alabama, then founded his own school in Mississippi on the Tuskegee model in 1902. He built the school with support from the South and the North. Most of his teachers were Tuskegee graduates, as was Holtzclaw's wife, Mary Ella Patterson Holtzclaw, who had charge of the girls' industries at Utica. Utica was a mirror of Tuskegee, both on campus and in its extension services to the surrounding rural black people. Holtzclaw was widely known in Mississippi for holding annual black farmers conferences at Utica, where he urged his audience to buy the land they worked rather than be tenant farmers. He earned a master's degree at the Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical College in 1908, attended Harvard summer sessions for a decade. In 1915, he published The Black Man's Burden in New York City, published by a commercial, white-owned publishing firm. His autobiography was positively reviewed in The Crisis, the organ of the NAACP. In another periodical, one of the founders of the NAACP, Mary White Ovington, wrote, quote, "We lay the book down with a sigh of wonder at the overcoming of so many obstacles and at the courage that continues the exhausting work of securing philanthropic support for a school that is an educational center for the Negroes of the whole state," unquote. The founder of Utica Institute contributed to various national magazines such as the Saturday Evening Post and the World's Work, in which he emphasized the importance of the type of Negro education that he himself learned at Tuskegee. He served as principal of Utica until his death in 1943. In his preface to Black Man's Burden, Holtzclaw assumed a pose of modesty that he maintains throughout his autobiography. His story, he says, whatever I am able to tell about my own life is typical. If there's one thing this man was not, it was typical. So this is why I'm calling this a pose of modesty. He certainly was not typical. He was extraordinary. So when he says his story is just the story of many others like myself who have struggled to get an education and be of use in the world, he's deliberately downplaying what he has accomplished and what he aims to accomplish. His aim in writing, he says, was simple. It is necessary that the two races in this country should know each other intimately if they are to live together. And that, in substance, is why I've written this book. He may say that he's going to give you an intimate portrait, but don't look for one. It's not there. He doesn't promise an intimate portrait or knowledge of himself in his autobiography. He promises an intimate knowledge of my race, and he claims that he is representative. Holtzclaw wanted his reader, especially his white reader, to read this story as the story of a typical Negro because he didn't want people to read it as the story of a stereotypical Negro. So he's trying to invent the idea of what a typical Negro is and then say, I'm a typical Negro. He's trying to say that I am representative of a Southern Negro from the post-Reconstruction era who has major ambitions, not for myself, but for my people. So the autobiographical portion of The Black Man's Burden is designed to show how this self-styled typical Negro pulled himself out of extremely disadvantageous origins to become an example of the kind of uplift that Holtzclaw put into practice institutionally for all the students who attended his school. William Holtzclaw was raised in appalling poverty. He writes that he and his siblings and the family's pet pig competed for leftover scraps from the table of the white family for whom his mother cooked to help support the family. The Holtzclaw children, he said, had no utensils or plates. They ate with their hands from their mother's skillet. His clothing until he reached early teens consisted of a homemade shirt, sometimes made from a crocus sack. Quote, I never wore a pair of shoes until I was 15, he writes. At the age of 4, his father put him to work on the farm, working with the father on the sharecropping responsibilities. At one point during his student years at Tuskegee, Holtzclaw was so broke that he could not afford to buy a second pair of pants. Even though the one pair he owned was so threadbare that the patches he tried to sew over the holes would not hold and would just rip larger holes in the pants. In my embarrassment, I went to one of the teachers from whom I thought I could get some sympathy and perhaps a pair of trousers, but I got neither. What I did get was a dignified lecture on independence and self-reliance. After that, I made up my mind that I would go naked before I would ask for another garment. These few instances offer a bit of insight into Holtzclaw, but characteristically, they also offer an ambiguity. Look at the statements again. The embarrassed student wearing pants that are so shabby and riddled with holes, probably in some very embarrassing places, goes to a male teacher for understanding and help. He desperately needs another pair of pants, or at least a little money towards the purchase of another pair of pants. But what does he get? A dignified lecture on independence and self-reliance. Now, there are two ways Holtzclaw might have reacted to that dignified lecture. He might have been extremely frustrated by the teacher's pompous indifference to his very real material need. The student didn't need words, he needed money, or at least a hand-me-down pair of pants. But it's also possible that Holtzclaw heard the lecture on independence and self-reliance and took it to heart. Maybe he was grateful to be reminded. I have no idea. Because Holtzclaw leaves us with no clear indication of how he felt about the lecture. The next sentence, after that, I made up my mind that I would go naked before I would ask for another garment, does not grant us access to the reason why Holtzclaw resolved to go naked rather than ask for another garment. Was he resentful of the teacher's pompous indifference? So resentful that his pride wouldn't let him risk that humiliation again? So he'd prefer humiliation, going naked, rather than expose himself to another rejection? Or did Holtzclaw resolve to go naked because he believed the teacher was right? He should be willing to undergo such humiliation before asking for a handout from someone. Holtzclaw doesn't let his reader know how he felt about this incident. We know what he did, but he does not reveal why he did it. In case you're wondering, Margaret Murray Washington, wife of the Tuskegee principal, saw Holtzclaw's need and gave him a second-hand Prince Albert suit, which he wore during the rest of his student days at Tuskegee. Holtzclaw recalled, again in his autobiography, "My fellow students, both boys and girls, made all sorts of faces at me when I appeared in my new suit, calling me preacher, reverend, doc, and other similar names." How did he feel about this teasing or ridicule? He doesn't say, of course. The turning point in Holtzclaw's life occurred in September 1902, when he resigned a well-paying job at Snow Hill Institute, left his wife and home, not permanently, but for a significant period of time, and set out for Mississippi, where he'd never been before in his life, to start a school with zero money. Why did he make this life-changing decision? All we learn from the black man's burden is that at Tuskegee, Mr. Washington's constant advice to us in his Sunday evening talks was that after leaving school we should go into one of the remote rural districts where we were most needed and teach. Remembering his father's urgings that he become a teacher, Holtzclaw, who had been thinking of studying to become a lawyer, abandoned that goal and not only decided to become a teacher, but determined to go to Mississippi, which to my mind was the darkest section of the South for a colored man. I wonder what Holtzclaw meant by darkest. Did he mean darkest with regard to demographics, the large majority of the people of Mississippi being black rather than white at the turn of the century? Or did he mean darkest with regard to the prevalence of racism and danger for a colored man, especially one who was attempting audaciously to start an enterprise like a school for black people? But I don't know which way he meant. Maybe he meant it both ways. All Holtzclaw confides to his reader is that he felt that going to Mississippi was his duty. "You are a coward," he wrote, "not to stick to what you know to be your duty." So he resolved, "I would go to Mississippi. Nothing but death should ever again come between me and fulfillment of my purpose." Holtzclaw was motivated by an overwhelming sense of responsibility to his people. But he could easily have done his duty to his people by staying right there at the Snow Hill Institute, which was also a rural school for Negroes, just in Alabama rather than Mississippi. Holtzclaw had started out running Snow Hill's printing office, but in 4 years had become the school's financial agent and treasurer. He was a trusted advisor to Snow Hill's founder, Tuskegee grad William J. Edwards. He was doing valuable uplift work at Snow Hill already. What could be cowardly about doing that work? Nevertheless, Holtzclaw implies that in his own eyes he was a coward for not committing to the fulfillment of my purpose, his mission, in other words. Evidently, to Holtzclaw, his purpose and mission were not to help build another man's school, but to establish and run his own. While Holtzclaw does his best to eschew all signs of egoism in the black man's burden, here I think we see his ambition, his unrelenting drive for success, nowhere so evident as when he tells us he could not respect himself as long as he stayed at Snow Hill. Only by setting out on his own to create his own school in the darkest section of the South for a colored man could Holtzclaw prove to himself that he was truly brave, truly worthy of self-respect, truly willing to risk all for the sake of the fulfillment of my purpose. What I've tried to suggest in these few quotations from the black man's burden is a fascinating mix of motives in Holtzclaw that his autobiography allows us only partial glimpses of, tantalizing hints at, when we probe behind the author's mask to try to understand what drove this man to take on the huge challenges and the considerable risks involved in starting the Utica experiment in turn-of-the-century Mississippi. There's one additional aspect of Holtzclaw's autobiography that many here may be curious about, and that is how the black man's burden talks about racism, discrimination. How does Holtzclaw deal with that? What did he do or say with regard to it in his autobiography? Today, when we read African American autobiographies, we're very sensitive to the process by which the author recognizes, confronts, and struggles against racism, prejudice, discrimination. A century ago, however, in most African American autobiographies, racism was generally treated not as a threat to self-fulfillment, but as a challenge to self-discipline. Talking about autobiographies published between 1865 and 1930. Holtzclaw saved his most explicit statement, if you want to call it explicit, about institutional racism for the last chapter of The Black Man's Burden. Even then, what he wrote is characteristically oblique. When traveling in strange and distant cities, I have found the hotels crowded. I have slept in parks and railway stations, and if my body suffered, my soul was so aflame with the fire of enthusiasm that it never flagged, nor held aught against my fellow men. When I have had to ride on the open cars for 3 consecutive days and nights with no rest, and with only such food as might be sold by the sandwich man through the window at way stations, I have suffered little, because I have had no time to think of personal ills. My mind was fixed on the cause for which I live and work. I have no time to sing minor notes. I have determined that the tune of my life shall be played on major keys. These statements are not peculiar to Holtzclaw among African American autobiographers between 1865 and 1930. The attitude towards the self, the personal, in these statements is truly typical of the institutional autobiographies that I've been talking about. To institution builders like Washington, William Edwards, William Holtzclaw, the personal ills had no time to think of personal ills, by which they must mean all the stuff I had to endure because of segregation, all the stuff I had to endure because of racial discrimination. That's merely personal. They treat it as sort of an irritation of the ego, not something to dwell on, not something to take personally. It's as though Holtzclaw is saying in this passage that because Jim Crow applied to all African Americans, he didn't feel personally insulted by it. Through rigorous self-control, a black man with a mission could look beyond what Holtzclaw would call minor difficulties, by which he meant, no doubt, the ceaseless insults, humiliations, and outright threats to his psychological and physical person that went with the territory for a black man who spent as much time on the road in the South 100 years ago as William Holtzclaw did. These personal ills didn't bother him, he claims, because he was so fixed on the cause for which I live and work. His mission enabled him not to suffer much from what he characterizes in these previous sentences as the problems he faced on a daily basis. If we could have him tonight, we might ask him, really? Did you really not suffer much? How much of this is the mask talking instead of the man? Who knows for sure? Just because we can't know for sure doesn't mean that insights shrouded in these ambiguities aren't fascinating and thought-provoking as we seek to come to terms with the meaning of Holtzclaw's life and mission for us today. By comparing Holtzclaw to Washington and their similar brands of institutional autobiography, I've tried to suggest where the black man's burden belongs in the trajectory of African American life writing coming out of the 19th century. I want to close my remarks by offering another comparison of the black man's burden to another African American autobiography by one of Holtzclaw's contemporaries, William Pickens. Holtzclaw and Pickens met in the spring of 1911, when the latter, here's a picture of William Pickens, visited Utica and wrote an admiring article about the Institute in the New York Independent, a prominent national newspaper. Holtzclaw liked Pickens' article so much that he reprinted big parts of it in The Black Man's Burden. No doubt when the two men met, it didn't take them long to discover all they had in common. Like Holtzclaw, Pickens had also been born in the South to parents who had endured slavery. Both men grew up under similarly disadvantageous circumstances, but had parents who were dedicated to their getting an education. Both men pursued higher education in the South. Pickens at Talladega College, where he earned a BA in 1902, 4 years after Holtzclaw graduated from Tuskegee. Both Pickens and Holtzclaw won oratory contests in college. Holtzclaw at Tuskegee, Pickens at Yale, where he went to pursue a second bachelor's degree, which he earned with a Phi Beta Kappa key as well, after he had graduated from Talladega. Both men were well acquainted with Booker T. Washington. Pickens wrote in his autobiography that I had many a cordial day with Booker T. Washington. We repeatedly found ourselves together as speakers on many large occasions, North and South. Like the Tuskegeean, both Holtzclaw and Pickens became educators. Holtzclaw, of course, by founding the Utica Institute in 1902, Pickens by joining the faculty of his alma mater in 1904. But Holtzclaw remained a strong Bookerite throughout his career as an institution builder and educator in Mississippi, while Pickens became an early member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, co-founded, of course, by W.B. Du Bois. By 1920, he was a new Negro, an exponent of the so-called radical ideas of Du Bois in the NAACP. I have never been afraid to stand alone, Pickens wrote in Bursting Bonds. Too little afraid, perhaps. I have never had a disposition to imitate any authority, either in writing an essay, making a speech, or sketching an autobiography. If Pickens read The Black Man's Burden or Up from Slavery, and I'm sure he read the latter, he didn't try to imitate either of these authorities. Tact, deference, diplomacy, those are the earmarks of institutional autobiographers. Washington and Holtzclaw are very good examples. Bursting Bonds is much more direct, explicit, and critical, particularly in dealing with white racism. Instead of the ambiguity of Holtzclaw's reference to Mississippi as the darkest section of the South for a colored man, Pickens describes the city in southeast Texas where he lived and worked as one of the worst sections in all this round world, certainly for any Negro to live in. He then adds, a complete statement of the unhappy situation and savage treatment of colored people in this section of the civilized world would not be believed by anyone who has not had personal experience with it. Holtzclaw, remember, downplays the personal ills of discrimination and segregation. Pickens takes very personally the injustice of Jim Crow and says so, very plainly, in his autobiography. In fact, Bursting Bonds contains a suspenseful account of a potentially violent incident when Pickens refused to leave a Pullman car in Arkansas after being ordered to do so by a white conductor. After refusing, Pickens calmly retires to his forbidden Pullman berth for the night. He writes in Bursting Bonds, I had no expectation of seeing the light of day again, so I had nothing to worry about. So I slept, but with the finger of my right hand coiled over the trigger of a deadly weapon. Pickens was ready to fight and die rather than be forced out of that Pullman after he had paid for the right to ride and sleep there. The author of Bursting Bonds proudly portrays himself as a fighter. He does not look back as Pickens did, Holtzclaw did, to the self-effacing style of Up From Slavery, but rather to the narratives of desperate fugitive slave escapees, like Douglass or Henry Box Brown, determined to risk their lives to seize their freedom. In the final lines of The Black Man's Burden, William Holtzclaw also identifies himself as a fighter for freedom. In the last lines of the book, he rededicates himself to the education of each individual child, as he says, in the Black Belt of Mississippi. Quote, these children must be educated, must be unfettered, set free. This, he proclaims, is the war that I must wage, and I propose to stay on the firing line and fight the good fight of faith. In this regard, of course, Holtzclaw closed his book with an allusion to 2 Timothy 4:7. Quote, I have fought the good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Perhaps in evoking these famous words of St. Paul, Holtzclaw hoped that his readers would understand him as a fighter too. But in leaving his reader with this image of himself as a fighter for faith, Holtzclaw offers us a departing ambiguity. Was he talking about Christian faith? Faith in a better future? Faith in his mission, no matter how many personal ills came his way? All of the above? How should we understand Holtzclaw's good fight in light of Washington on the one hand and Pickens on the other? Well, I hope these questions will be as interesting and thought-provoking to you as they have been for me for so many years. And I look forward to talking with you more about them now that my talk is over. Thank you very much.